My name is Olivia, and for 28 years, I lived as the invisible daughter in a family that worshipped my younger brother, Jake. While they celebrated his every mediocre accomplishment, I quietly built a tech empire worth $12 million. Last Christmas, when my secret finally exploded over eggnog and holiday cookies, I watched my father's jaw literally drop to the floor. Let me tell you how we got here. Growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, our family looked like the American dream from the outside. My dad, Robert, worked as a middle manager at an insurance company, while my mom, Linda, taught kindergarten at the local elementary school. We lived in a ranch-style house with a 2-car garage and a decent backyard where Dad installed a basketball hoop that would become the center of Jake's universe. From the moment Jake arrived when I was 4, he became the sun around which our family orbited. I have crystal clear memories of my parents' faces lighting up whenever he entered a room, the way they hung on his every word, documented his every milestone with the devotion of National Geographic photographers capturing rare wildlife. My earliest memory of the favoritism was when I was 7 and Jake was 3. I had spent weeks preparing for the school spelling bee, staying up late with flashcards, practicing words until I could spell encyclopedia in my sleep. The night before the competition, I won the school-wide bee, beating 5th graders as a 2nd grader. I rushed home bursting with excitement, clutching my first-place certificate. "Mom! Dad! I won! I beat everyone!" I announced, practically bouncing through the front door. My parents were in the living room with Jake, who had just successfully used the potty for the 3rd time that day. "That's nice, honey," Mom said distractedly, then turned back to Jake with theatrical excitement. "Who's Mommy's big boy? Who used the potty like a champion?" Dad was already on his knees with the camcorder, filming Jake's victory dance around the coffee table. My spelling bee certificate ended up on the refrigerator for exactly 2 days before being replaced by Jake's finger painting of what he claimed was a dinosaur, but looked more like a green blob. This pattern established itself early and never wavered. When Jake started playing basketball in elementary school, my parents attended every practice and game, complete with custom t-shirts reading Jake's dad and Jake's mom. They installed professional-grade floodlights in our backyard so he could practice at night, transforming our modest yard into his personal training facility. Meanwhile, I discovered my passion for computers and programming. At age 10, I taught myself basic HTML and built my first website, a fan page for our pet hamster, complete with animated GIFs and a visitor counter. When I showed it to my parents, excited about this new world I'd discovered, Dad glanced at the screen for maybe 3 seconds. "That's nice, Olivia." "Very technical," he said before turning back to the basketball game on TV, where Jake was riding the bench for his recreational league team. "Look at that kid's form. Jake's got natural talent." I spent my allowance on programming books from the library book sale, staying up late learning JavaScript, while Jake got expensive basketball shoes and private coaching lessons. By middle school, I was building websites for local businesses, earning my first real money while my parents paid for Jake's travel team fees and tournament hotels. High school crystallized the disparity even further. Jake made varsity basketball as a sophomore, which was genuinely impressive, though he was primarily a bench player. My parents treated this like he'd been drafted by the Lakers. They bought season tickets, organized team dinners, and my mom became president of the Booster Club. Our living room became a shrine to Jake's athletic career, filled with team photos, participation ribbons, and newspaper clippings of games where he might have played 3 minutes. During this same period, I was quietly revolutionizing our school's computer systems. I redesigned the website, created an online gradebook system that teachers still use today, and won the state championship in computer programming 3 consecutive years. My parents attended exactly 0 of these competitions. When I placed 3rd in a national coding competition, earning a $5,000 scholarship, the conversation at dinner lasted approximately 30 seconds before pivoting to Jake's upcoming basketball camp. "That's great about your computer thing," Mom said, passing the mashed potatoes. "Jake, tell us more about this college scout who's supposedly coming to watch you play." The scout never materialized, and Jake's basketball career peaked in high school, but the family narrative never adjusted to reality. My relationship with Jake himself was complicated. He wasn't malicious or deliberately cruel. He was simply the product of a childhood where every adult in his life told him he was special, talented, and destined for greatness. He genuinely believed his modest athletic abilities were extraordinary because no one had ever given him objective feedback. In his mind, he was being recruited by colleges, he wasn't, had professional potential, he didn't, and deserved the family's intense focus and financial investment. When Jake graduated high school with a 2.8 GPA and no athletic scholarships, my parents spent months making excuses and blaming external factors. The coaches didn't recognize his talent. The system was political. Other kids had unfair advantages. They took out a second mortgage to send him to a small private college where he could pursue his dreams of playing basketball while studying sports management. I graduated valedictorian with a 4.0 GPA and a full academic scholarship to Colorado State University's computer science program. My graduation party lasted 2 hours and consisted mainly of relatives asking when Jake would be visiting home from college. His send-off party the previous month had been a neighborhood event with catered food and a custom banner. College became my escape and my launching pad. While Jake was struggling through remedial classes and riding the bench at a Division III school that my parents visited every other weekend, I was discovering my true potential in an environment that valued merit over family mythology. My computer science professors recognized something special in my approach to problem solving. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who taught advanced algorithms, pulled me aside after a particularly challenging assignment that I'd completed in half the time of other students. "Olivia, have you considered starting your own projects outside of classwork?" she asked. "You have an intuitive understanding of user experience that's rare in programmers." That conversation changed my trajectory. Instead of just learning to code, I started thinking about real-world applications for technology. I noticed problems everywhere and began building solutions. The university's food service system was inefficient, so I created an app that reduced wait times by 30%. The library's book reservation system was archaic, so I built a modern interface that increased usage by 40%. By my junior year, I wasn't just completing assignments. I was creating intellectual property with genuine commercial value. While my classmates focused on getting good grades, I was building a portfolio of applications that solved real problems for real users. The breakthrough came during my senior year capstone project. I identified a gap in small business inventory management. Existing software was either too expensive for startups or too simplistic for growing companies. I spent 8 months developing what would eventually become my first major success, a cloud-based inventory system that was both affordable and scalable. My professor was impressed enough to help me patent the software and connect me with potential investors. By graduation, I had 3 businesses interested in licensing my system and 1 venture capital firm ready to fund a startup. Meanwhile, Jake's college basketball career ended exactly as objective observers might have predicted. After 2 years of minimal playing time, he quit the team to focus on his studies, which my parents spun as a mature decision to prioritize academics. His grades improved marginally, but he was still struggling through a sports management program at a school that cost more per year than many people's salaries. The contrast in our post-graduation paths was stark but invisible to my family. Jake moved back home after college, eventually finding work as an assistant manager at a sporting goods store. My parents were thrilled that he was gaining business experience and learning the retail industry from the ground floor. They helped him lease an apartment, co-signed for a new car, and continued providing financial support well into his 20s. I moved to Austin, Texas, and launched my startup with $150,000 in venture capital funding. The first year was brutal. 18-hour days, ramen noodles for dinner, and sleeping on an air mattress in a shared apartment. But the software was gaining traction, and by year 2, we had major clients and consistent revenue. During family phone calls, I kept my professional updates vague. When asked about work, I'd say things like going well or keeping busy, while listening to detailed reports about Jake's progress at the sporting goods store, his recreational basketball league statistics, and his on and off relationship with his high school girlfriend. Jake got Employee of the Month again, Mom would announce proudly during our weekly calls. His manager says he has real leadership potential. Meanwhile, how's your computer job? Still working long hours? By age 25, my company had grown to 15 employees and $2 million in annual revenue. We'd expanded beyond inventory management into comprehensive business solutions, and I was fielding acquisition offers from major tech companies. I lived in a beautiful condo in downtown Austin, drove a Tesla, and had more money in my investment accounts than my parents had in their retirement savings. To my family, I was still just Olivia who worked with computers somewhere in Texas. The decision to maintain this fiction wasn't entirely conscious at first. Initially, I simply didn't bother correcting their assumptions about my modest success. But as the years passed and the wealth accumulated, the deception became more deliberate. I realized that revealing my success would fundamentally change our family dynamic, and I wasn't sure I wanted that change. There was also, if I'm being honest, a part of me that enjoyed having a secret they couldn't diminish or overshadow. For once in my life, I had something that was entirely mine, untouched by their favoritism and unaffected by their inability to see me clearly. When I did visit Denver, which was rarely, I was careful to maintain the illusion. I'd rent a modest car at the airport, wear simple clothes from Target, and stay in my childhood bedroom that still had the same furniture from high school. I'd talk about my job in generic terms while listening to updates about Jake's promotion to assistant manager, his new girlfriend who was really special this time, and his plans to eventually open his own sporting goods store with my parents' financial backing. The cognitive dissonance was sometimes surreal. During one visit, I sat in our family living room listening to Dad explain why Jake needed a $15,000 loan to pursue a personal training certification, while I had $50,000 sitting in my checking account that I'd earned in passive income that month. Mom worried aloud about Jake's financial stability while I owned stock in 3 companies worth more than their house. "It's tough being young and trying to establish yourself," Dad said, writing another check for Jake's latest venture. "Not everyone can be as practical and low maintenance as Olivia." The irony was suffocating. My romantic relationships suffered under the weight of this double life. Dating successful men in Austin meant constantly editing stories about my family, explaining why I was evasive about visits home, and maintaining separate social media accounts to prevent worlds from colliding. Several relationships ended because partners couldn't understand my reluctance to integrate them into my family life. Everything changed when I met David Chen, a software engineer who had sold his own startup and understood both the demands of building a company and the complex emotions that come with sudden wealth. David saw through my casual deflections about family from our first date. "You talk about your work like it's just a job, but everything else about you screams entrepreneur," he said over dinner at a high-end restaurant in downtown Austin. "Your problem-solving approach, your risk tolerance, the way you think about scaling systems. You're not an employee." That night, I told him everything about my company, my wealth, and the elaborate fiction I maintained with my family. Instead of judgment, David offered understanding. "Family dynamics are complicated," he said, "but living 2 completely separate lives has to be exhausting. When do you plan to just be yourself?" The question haunted me for months. David was right. Maintaining the deception required constant mental energy. Every phone call home was a performance. Every visit required careful preparation, and every family milestone was shadowed by the knowledge of how different reality was from their perceptions. The breaking point came when Jake announced his engagement to his longtime girlfriend, Ashley. My parents immediately began planning an elaborate wedding that they couldn't afford, taking out loans and dipping into their retirement savings to fund what Mom called the wedding of Jake's dreams. During a family planning call that included detailed discussions of venue costs, catering expenses, and honeymoon funding, I listened to my parents stress about money while simultaneously offering to contribute thousands of dollars they didn't have toward Jake's perfect day. "We might need to mortgage the house again," Dad admitted quietly. But Jake only gets married once, and Ashley has her heart set on that venue. Meanwhile, I could have paid for the entire wedding with what I earned in a single month, without affecting my lifestyle in any way. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I would attend Jake's wedding, but I would go as myself, not the fictional version of Olivia, who worked a simple computer job, but the real Olivia, who had built something extraordinary. David supported the decision and agreed to accompany me as my date, providing moral support for what I knew would be a revelation that would shock my family to its core. I spent weeks preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. I practiced conversations in my head, anticipating their reactions, trying to predict whether they would be proud, angry, confused, or some combination of all three. What I couldn't predict was how dramatically one moment of honesty would reshape our entire family narrative. The wedding was held at an upscale venue in Denver that cost more than many people's annual salaries. As David and I walked through the entrance, I took inventory of the details my parents had stressed over funding. The elaborate floral arrangements, the premium bar service, the live band, the photographer who charged more than most people make in a month. Every element represented financial sacrifice from parents who had spent their entire lives prioritizing Jake's dreams over practical considerations, including their own retirement security. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the way that expensive weddings tend to be. Jake looked genuinely happy. Ashley was radiant in her designer dress, and my parents beamed with pride as they watched their son marry his college sweetheart. I felt a complex mix of emotions: genuine happiness for Jake, sadness about our family dynamic, and anticipation about what I planned to do. During the cocktail hour, I mingled with relatives I hadn't seen in years, most of whom knew me as the quiet daughter who worked with computers. Several asked about my little job and whether I was still doing that computer thing. I deflected politely while David observed the family dynamics with anthropological fascination. "It's like they've created an alternative reality," he whispered during a quiet moment. "Jake is treated like a Fortune 500 CEO, and you're regarded as the family underachiever. It's remarkable." The reception dinner provided a perfect storm of circumstances for my revelation. Seated at the family table between my parents and various aunts and uncles, I found myself in the center of conversations about everyone's career updates, financial situations, and future plans. My Aunt Carol, who had always been somewhat tactless, decided to address me directly during the salad course. "So, Olivia, when are you going to settle down and start a family? You're not getting any younger, and that computer job of yours isn't exactly husband hunting territory." Before I could respond, my Uncle Mike chimed in. "At least she has steady work. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur like Jake here." He raised his glass toward my brother, who was holding court at the head table. I felt David's hand squeeze mine under the table, a reminder that I didn't have to tolerate these assumptions anymore. "Actually," I said calmly, I am an entrepreneur. I own a software company." The casual way I delivered this information seemed to confuse rather than impress them. Aunt Carol nodded politely. "That's nice, dear. Small business is so important." "Not exactly small," I continued, my heart starting to race. "We have offices in 3 cities and about 40 employees now." This got my father's attention. He turned from his conversation with my cousin to focus on what I was saying. 40 employees? I thought you worked for someone else." "I used to. I started my own company 5 years ago." Mom leaned forward, looking concerned. "Olivia, honey, why didn't you tell us you left your job? Are you having financial problems? Do you need help?" The assumption that I must be struggling, that entrepreneurship meant instability rather than success, was so characteristic of their perception of me that I almost laughed. "No, Mom, I'm doing very well. The company has been quite successful." David, sensing that I needed encouragement to continue, asked a leading question. "Olivia, didn't you just close that acquisition deal? The one worth 8 figures?" The table went quiet. Even Jake, despite being occupied with wedding festivities at the head table, seemed to sense that something significant was happening at our table. 8 figures? Dad repeated slowly. What kind of software company are we talking about here? I took a deep breath, realizing there was no graceful way to ease into this revelation. My company is worth approximately $40 million. I own 60% of it, and we're in talks with 2 major corporations about acquisition. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced at a family gathering. Aunt Carol's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Uncle Mike stared at me like I'd announced I was secretly a space alien. My mother's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and something approaching shock. Dad found his voice first. $40 million? Olivia, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I built a successful technology company, Dad. We provide business solutions software to mid-sized companies across the country. Last year, our revenue was $12 million. Mom was shaking her head slowly. This doesn't make sense. You never mentioned. We had no idea. Because you never asked, I said, my voice remaining steady despite the emotional turbulence I felt inside. In 5 years, not once did any of you ask for specifics about my work. You assumed it was entry-level and boring, so I let you believe that. The revelation was spreading beyond our immediate table. Other relatives were starting to listen, and I could see Jake trying to figure out why our section of the reception had gone silent during what should have been a celebratory dinner. Uncle Mike, who had always been somewhat skeptical of anyone's success, decided to challenge my claims. Come on, Olivia, if you were really worth that much money, we'd know about it. You don't live like a millionaire. David reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Actually, she was just featured in Austin Business Journal as one of the city's top entrepreneurs under 30. He showed the screen to Uncle Mike, displaying a photo of me accepting an award at a technology conference. The photo showed me in professional attire, holding a crystal plaque, surrounded by other successful business owners. It was completely inconsistent with the image of modest, struggling Olivia that my family had maintained. Mom grabbed the phone from Uncle Mike, staring at the photo like it was evidence of an elaborate hoax. This is really you? Yes, Mom. This is really me. The conversation was interrupted by Jake's approach to our table. He'd noticed the unusual energy and come to investigate, leaving his new bride temporarily at the head table. Everything okay over here? He asked, his arm around Dad's shoulders. You all look like someone died. Your sister apparently owns a multi-million-dollar company, Aunt Carol announced, her voice carrying a mix of amazement and skepticism. Jake laughed, assuming this was some kind of family joke. Olivia? She works in tech support or something, right? He looked at me directly for the first time all evening. What's this about? It's about the fact that I've spent the last 5 years building a software company that's worth more than $40 million, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. The laughter died in Jake's throat. He looked around the table, reading the serious expressions on everyone's faces, slowly realizing this wasn't a joke. 40 million? He repeated. Olivia, that's not possible. David handed his phone to Jake, showing him the Business Journal article. Jake read in silence, his expression changing from confusion to something approaching disbelief. This says you have 40 employees, Jake said slowly, and that you've revolutionized inventory management software. Olivia, I don't understand. When did this happen? It's been happening for years, Jake. While you were trying to make it in sporting goods retail, I was building a technology company. The words came out more harshly than I'd intended, but years of suppressed frustration were bubbling to the surface. Jake's face flushed red, and I could see him processing not just the information about my success, but the implicit comparison between our career paths. Mom finally found her voice. Olivia, if this is true, why didn't you tell us? Why would you keep something this important secret from your family? Because you never showed any interest in my life, I said, my composure finally beginning to crack. Because every phone call home was about Jake's job, Jake's relationships, Jake's plans. Because when I tried to talk about my work, you changed the subject or gave me generic responses before pivoting back to whatever Jake was doing. Dad was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and confusion. Olivia, we had no idea. If you were building something this significant, we would have wanted to know. Would you? I challenged. Because I tried to share my excitement about technology and programming for years. I tried to explain what I was working on, what I was learning, what I was building, and you responded with distracted nods and comments about how I was always good with computers. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for decades and finally burst into flames. Jake was still holding David's phone, reading details about my company's growth, my industry recognition, my success in a field he'd never bothered to understand. 60% ownership of a $40 million company, Jake said slowly, clearly doing the math. Olivia, that means you're worth about $24 million, I finished, plus other investments, real estate, and liquid assets. My net worth is approximately $30 million. The number seemed to hit the table like a physical force. Aunt Carol gasped audibly. Uncle Mike sat back in his chair like he'd been pushed. Mom put her hand over her mouth, tears starting to form in her eyes. Dad was silent for a long moment, and then asked the question I'd been dreading. Why, Olivia? Why keep this from us? We're your family. Because you're the family that spent my entire childhood treating me like I was invisible, I said, the words tumbling out faster now. You're the family that attended every one of Jake's basketball games but missed every one of my academic competitions. You're the family that redecorated Jake's room 3 times while I kept the same furniture from elementary school through high school graduation. Olivia, that's not fair, Mom protested. We supported both of you. We just supported you differently. You supported Jake, I corrected. You enabled, funded, praised, and celebrated Jake. You tolerated me. Jake was looking increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation revealed family dynamics he'd never consciously acknowledged. As the beneficiary of all this preferential treatment, he'd simply assumed it was normal parental behavior. That's not true, Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mom and Dad love both of us. Love and favoritism aren't mutually exclusive, I replied. I know they love me, but they've never respected me, never believed in my potential, and never showed the slightest interest in understanding what I was capable of achieving. The reception continued around us, but our table had become an island of family drama in a sea of wedding celebration. Other guests were starting to notice the intense conversation, and I realized we were creating exactly the kind of scene that would overshadow Jake's special day. Maybe we should continue this conversation later, David suggested diplomatically. This is Jake and Ashley's night. But Jake, perhaps feeling defensive about the years of preferential treatment that were being exposed, wasn't ready to let the subject drop. So what, Olivia? You made a bunch of money, and now you're bitter that we didn't predict your success? You're going to ruin my wedding because you feel underappreciated? The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. I had chosen this moment, this venue, this audience for my revelation, but his characterization of my motivations missed the deeper point entirely. I'm not ruining your wedding, Jake. I'm just tired of pretending to be someone I'm not to make everyone else comfortable. Comfortable? Dad interjected. Olivia, if you've been this successful, why wouldn't you want to share that with us? Aren't you proud of what you've accomplished? I am proud, I said. But I wanted you to be proud of me before you knew about the money. I wanted you to value my intelligence, my work ethic, my creativity. Instead, you dismissed me as the practical daughter who was good with computers and left it at that. Mom was crying openly now, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Olivia, we are proud of you. We've always been proud. You've been proud of Jake, I said gently but firmly. You've been comfortable with me. There's a difference. The conversation was interrupted by Ashley's appearance at our table. Jake's new bride looked radiant, but concerned about the obvious tension she'd observed from across the room. Is everything okay? She asked, placing her hand on Jake's shoulder. People are starting to ask questions. Jake looked around the table at his family, his parents still processing the revelation that their overlooked daughter was worth more than $30 million. His sister sitting calmly beside her boyfriend who had photographic evidence of her extraordinary success, and various relatives trying to reconcile the modest Olivia they'd known with this new information. "Everything's fine," Jake said, though nothing about the situation appeared fine. "Olivia was just telling us about her business success." Ashley smiled politely, clearly not understanding the magnitude of what had just been revealed. "That's wonderful. What kind of business?" "Software development," I said simply. "I own a technology company." "How exciting," Ashley replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Jake never mentioned you were an entrepreneur. That's amazing." The innocent comment highlighted exactly what I'd been trying to explain. Jake had never mentioned my work because he'd never understood its significance. To him, I was just his sister, who worked with computers, not someone whose professional accomplishments might be worth discussing. David, sensing an opportunity to shift the energy in a more positive direction, engaged Ashley in conversation about the wedding while the rest of us sat in uncomfortable silence. After a few minutes, Jake and Ashley returned to their head table, leaving our family to process what had just happened. The remainder of the reception passed in a surreal blur. I danced with David, made small talk with relatives who now viewed me entirely differently, and watched my parents struggle to reconcile their decades-old assumptions with this new reality. Several cousins approached me with questions about my company, investment advice, and job opportunities for their children. Conversations that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. Uncle Mike, who had been skeptical about my claims, spent considerable time researching my company on his phone and eventually approached me with an apology and a business proposition. "Olivia, I had no idea. I run a small manufacturing company, and I think we could really use your software solutions." The immediate shift in how I was perceived and treated was both validating and disturbing. These were the same people who had dismissed or ignored me for years, and now they were suddenly interested in my opinions, my expertise, and my connections. The change felt hollow rather than satisfying. As the evening wound down, Dad approached me while David was getting our coats. "Olivia, I think we need to have a serious conversation," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "About a lot of things." "I think you're right," I agreed. "Can you come by the house tomorrow before you fly back to Austin? Your mother and we need to understand how we got this so wrong." The next morning, I sat in my childhood living room, still dominated by Jake's basketball trophies and photos, having the most honest conversation I'd ever had with my parents. Without the audience of wedding guests and extended family, the discussion was more raw but also more productive. "We failed you," Dad said simply, his eyes red from what appeared to be a sleepless night. "We got so focused on managing Jake's needs that we took your strengths for granted." Mom nodded tearfully. "You were always so capable, so independent. We thought that meant you needed less from us, but that wasn't fair to you." "I did need less management," I agreed, "but I needed more recognition. I needed you to see what I was building, to ask questions about my work, to show interest in my achievements." "We should have realized," Dad continued, "when you graduated valedictorian, when you got that full scholarship, when you moved to Austin and started talking about your projects, we should have paid attention." "The signs were there," I admitted, "but you were always so focused on Jake that everything else became background noise." The conversation continued for hours, covering decades of family dynamics, missed opportunities, and accumulated resentments. My parents acknowledged their favoritism, their failure to nurture my ambitions, and their assumption that my success was less significant than Jake's struggles. "What can we do now?" Mom asked. "How do we rebuild our relationship?" "Start by seeing me as I actually am," I said, "not as the practical daughter who doesn't need attention, but as someone who built something remarkable and wanted her family to notice." "We notice now," Dad said, "and we're incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." "I appreciate that," I replied, "but I need you to understand that I'm still the same person I was yesterday. The only thing that changed is your awareness of my success. I would rather have had your pride and recognition before you knew about the money." The conversation was interrupted by Jake's arrival at the house. He looked exhausted, and I suspected he'd also had a sleepless night processing the previous evening's revelations. "Olivia, can we talk?" he asked, glancing at our parents. Maybe privately? We walked out to the backyard, to the basketball hoop that had been the center of so much family attention during our childhood. Jake sat on the steps leading to the back door, and I joined him. "I've been thinking all night," he began, "about what you said, about how Mom and Dad treated us growing up. And I think you were right." The admission surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness, justification, or denial, not acknowledgement. "I never noticed because I was benefiting from it," he continued. "But looking back, yeah, they focused on me way too much. And they didn't pay attention to what you were doing." "I don't blame you for that, Jake," I said. "You were a kid receiving attention and support. That's normal and healthy. The problem was that it was disproportionate." "Still," he said, "I should have noticed. I should have paid attention to my sister's life." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the morning light filter through the trees that had grown taller since our childhood. $30 million, Jake said finally. "Olivia, that's incredible. And I had no idea what you were building." "I wanted to tell you," I said, "all of you. But every time I tried to share what I was working on, it felt like no one was really listening." "We weren't," Jake admitted. I wasn't. I was so wrapped up in my own stuff, trying to make basketball work, then figuring out what to do when it didn't work, then trying to build a career in retail. I never asked about your work beyond generic questions. "You were dealing with your own challenges," I said, offering him grace I wasn't sure he deserved, but that felt necessary for moving forward. "That's no excuse for being a terrible brother," Jake replied. "Olivia, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of what you built, and I'm sorry it took learning about your net worth for me to pay attention to your success." The apology felt genuine, and I found myself emotional in a way I hadn't expected. "Thank you," I said simply. "So what happens now?" Jake asked. "With the family, I mean. Everything's different." "I hope it's different," I said, "but in good ways. I hope we can build relationships based on who we actually are rather than on old assumptions and patterns." "And the money?" Jake asked tentatively. "I mean, I don't want anything from you, but it's going to be weird knowing my sister is worth more than some small countries." I laughed, the first genuine laughter I'd shared with my brother in years. "It's still just me, Jake. I drive a nice car and live in a nice apartment, but I'm not buying islands or anything dramatic." "Still," he said, "it's going to take some adjusting." The months following Jake's wedding marked a period of significant change in our family dynamics. My parents made genuine efforts to show interest in my work, asking detailed questions about my company and celebrating milestones they'd previously ignored. Dad started reading technology news so he could understand my industry better, and Mom began telling her teacher friends about her daughter, the successful entrepreneur. The change felt authentic rather than performative. They weren't suddenly interested in me because of my wealth. They were finally seeing me as a complete person rather than the simplified version they'd maintained in their minds. My relationship with Jake also evolved in unexpected ways. He became genuinely curious about my work, asking thoughtful questions about business strategy, technology trends, and entrepreneurship. We began having regular phone conversations that focused on my life and interests rather than perfunctory check-ins about his latest workplace drama. "I never realized how interesting your field is," he said during one call. "I always thought technology was just about fixing computers, but what you're doing is solving real problems for businesses." "That's what I've been trying to explain for years," I replied, but without bitterness. "I'm glad you're finally interested in learning about it." The financial disparity between us remained awkward at times. Jake and Ashley were saving for a house down payment, while I could buy several houses without affecting my lifestyle. When they mentioned struggling with student loan payments, I offered to help, but Jake declined. "I appreciate it, Olivia, but I need to handle this myself," he said. "I've been dependent on family money for too long. It's time I figured out how to be financially independent." I respected his decision and was actually proud of his commitment to self-reliance. It suggested he was finally understanding some of the principles I'd learned through building my own success. The most challenging aspect of post-revelation family life was managing the expectations and requests from extended relatives. Word had spread throughout our family network that Olivia, the quiet computer girl, was actually worth $30 million. Suddenly, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out with investment opportunities, business propositions, and sob stories about financial hardships. My cousin Jennifer, who had barely acknowledged my existence at family gatherings, sent a lengthy email explaining how her daughter needed help with college tuition. "I know we haven't been close, but family should help family," she wrote, apparently forgetting that she'd never shown any interest in my life until she learned about my bank account. Uncle Mike's sudden pivot from skeptic to business partner was particularly jarring. Within a week of the wedding, he'd researched my company extensively and was calling with detailed proposals for how we could work together. While his interest felt more professional than purely mercenary, the timing was impossible to ignore. I established strict boundaries around these requests. I would not discuss my finances with extended family, would not provide loans or investments based on family relationships, and would not feel guilty about protecting my resources from people who had never invested emotionally in our relationships. The one exception I made was for my parents' retirement security. Despite our complicated history, I quietly paid off their mortgage and established a trust fund that would ensure their financial stability without them having direct access to my wealth. I did this not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to remove financial stress from their lives so we could focus on rebuilding our relationship. 6 months after the wedding revelation, I was invited to speak at a technology conference in Denver. It was the first time I would appear professionally in my hometown, and I invited my parents and Jake to attend. Watching them in the audience as I delivered a keynote address about innovation in business software was surreal. For the first time in my life, I saw recognition in their eyes, not just acknowledgement of my success, but understanding of my expertise and passion. After my presentation, Dad approached me backstage with tears in his eyes. "Olivia, I finally understand what you've been building," he said. "Not just the company, but your vision for how technology can solve real problems. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was right in front of me." Mom was equally emotional. Watching you up there, seeing how the audience responded to your ideas, I realized we never really knew who you were. We saw what we expected to see instead of who you actually are. Jake's response was perhaps the most meaningful. "Olivia, you're not just successful, you're brilliant," he said. "I always knew you were smart, but I never understood that you were visionary smart. What you've built isn't just a business, it's innovation that's changing how companies operate." The technology conference marked a turning point in how my hometown viewed me as well. Local business leaders who had never heard of my company suddenly wanted to meet with me. The Denver Business Journal ran a feature story about my success, framing it as a hometown entrepreneur who had made it big in Austin. The attention was gratifying, but also overwhelming. I realized that part of what I had valued about my secret success was the privacy it afforded me. Now that my achievements were public knowledge, I lost some of the anonymity I had enjoyed. David, who had been incredibly supportive throughout the family drama, proposed to me 6 months after Jake's wedding. His proposal came during a quiet evening at home in Austin, away from family complications and public attention. "I love both versions of you," he said as he got down on one knee. The successful entrepreneur who commands boardrooms and the woman who was brave enough to finally show her family who she really is. Will you marry me? Planning our wedding became an exercise in managing family dynamics that had shifted dramatically since my revelation. My parents were now eager to be involved, offering to help with everything from venue selection to guest lists. Jake volunteered to handle the bachelor and bachelorette parties, wanting to contribute to my happiness in ways he had never considered before. The attention felt strange after decades of being overlooked, but I recognized it as genuine rather than opportunistic. My family wasn't suddenly interested in me because of my money. They were finally seeing me as a complete person worthy of celebration and support. I chose to have a modest wedding by Austin standards, though it was more elaborate than anything my family had previously associated with practical Olivia. The venue was elegant, the flowers were beautiful, and the guest list included successful entrepreneurs, technology leaders, and venture capitalists alongside my family and childhood friends. During her maid of honor speech, my childhood friend Lisa, who had witnessed years of family favoritism, addressed the transformation directly. "Olivia has always been extraordinary," she said, looking at my parents in the audience. "I'm glad her family finally sees what the rest of us have known all along." The comment was gentle but pointed, acknowledging the past while celebrating the present. My parents nodded tearfully, accepting the truth of her observation without defensiveness. My wedding day felt like the culmination of a long journey toward authenticity. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't maintaining any facades or managing any deceptions. My family saw me clearly, my achievements were acknowledged, and I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I actually was, rather than who they thought I should be. Jake's toast during the reception surprised everyone, including me. "Olivia, you taught me something important through this whole experience," he said, raising his glass. "Success isn't about getting attention or recognition from other people. It's about building something meaningful and staying true to yourself even when no one is watching. You did that for years while I was busy trying to impress everyone with mediocre basketball skills." He paused, looking emotional. "You're not just my successful sister. You're my role model. Thank you for showing me what real achievement looks like." The acknowledgement meant more to me than any business award or financial milestone. After 30 years, my little brother finally saw me. 2 years after my wedding revelation, our family had settled into a new normal that felt healthier and more authentic than anything we'd experienced before. My parents had become genuinely supportive of my career, following my company's growth with the same enthusiasm they had once reserved for Jake's athletic pursuits. Jake had used the wake-up call of my success story to refocus his own career goals. He left retail management and enrolled in business school, financing his education through loans rather than family support. His determination to build his own success independently was admirable and showed real personal growth. "I spent too many years expecting things to be handed to me," he told me during one of our regular phone calls. "Watching you build something from nothing made me realize I need to earn my achievements rather than just hoping for them." The most significant change was in how our family communicated. Instead of superficial check-ins focused on Jake's latest developments, our conversations became deeper and more balanced. My parents asked thoughtful questions about my work, David's architectural projects, and our future plans. Jake shared his business school experiences and sought my advice on entrepreneurship and strategic thinking. During a family dinner in Denver, Mom reflected on the transformation. "I can't believe we almost missed knowing who you really are," she said, looking at me across the table. "You could have stayed hidden forever, and we would have continued thinking of you as our practical daughter who was good with computers." "I'm glad I didn't stay hidden," I replied, "but I'm also glad it took me 30 years to reveal myself. I needed to build my success on my own terms before sharing it with people who might not have understood or supported the journey." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "You were protecting something precious," he said. "Your vision, your work ethic, your independence. We might have interfered with that if we'd known from the beginning." The observation was insightful and showed how much his perspective had evolved. He understood that my secrecy hadn't been about spite or manipulation. It had been about creating space to grow without interference or judgment. Looking back, I realized that the years of being overlooked had actually been a gift in disguise. Without the pressure of family expectations or the burden of their financial dependence, I had been free to take risks, make mistakes, and build something extraordinary according to my own standards. The invisibility that had felt so painful during childhood became the foundation for adult success. While Jake was learning to depend on external validation and support, I was developing internal motivation and self-reliance. While he was performing for an audience, I was quietly building skills and knowledge that would eventually create genuine achievement. The revelation at Jake's wedding hadn't just changed how my family saw me. It had forced me to confront how I saw myself. For years, I had defined myself in opposition to their neglect, using their dismissal as motivation to prove them wrong. Once they finally acknowledged my success, I had to find new sources of meaning and purpose beyond family validation. Working with my therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, I explored this transition from external motivation to internal satisfaction. You spent decades building success to show your family what they were missing, she observed. Now that they see it, what drives you? The question forced me to examine my relationship with achievement and recognition. I realized that while family acknowledgement felt good, it wasn't actually necessary for my sense of fulfillment. The work itself, solving problems, building solutions, creating value for clients, provided its own rewards. 3 years after the wedding revelation, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold my company to a major corporation for $65 million, keeping a small equity stake, but stepping back from day-to-day operations. The decision wasn't about money. I already had more than I could spend in a lifetime. It was about freedom to pursue new challenges without the pressure of managing a growing organization. I wanted to travel with David, explore new technologies, and maybe start a family without the demands of running a 40-person company. My parents were initially worried about my decision. "Are you sure about this, Olivia?" Mom asked during a phone call. "You worked so hard to build that company." "I built it to prove something to myself," I explained, "and to prove something to all of you. Mission accomplished on both fronts. Now I want to build a life rather than just a business." Jake understood immediately. "You're choosing happiness over achievement," he said. "That's actually really wise." The sale of my company provided me with complete financial independence and the freedom to pursue whatever interested me next. David and I bought a house on Lake Austin, traveled extensively, and began discussing starting a family. I also became more intentional about philanthropy, establishing a foundation focused on supporting young women in technology. Having experienced the challenges of being overlooked and underestimated, I wanted to create opportunities for the next generation of female entrepreneurs. The foundation's first major initiative was a scholarship program for high school girls interested in computer science and engineering. During the scholarship award ceremony, I found myself thinking about my teenage self, brilliant and driven, but dismissed by the people who should have been her biggest supporters. "Don't wait for other people to recognize your potential," I told the scholarship recipients. "Build something so extraordinary that recognition becomes irrelevant. Your worth isn't determined by external validation. It's determined by what you create and contribute to the world." One recipient, a 17-year-old named Maria, who reminded me of myself at that age, approached me after the ceremony. "Miss Chen, did your family always support your interest in technology?" she asked. "No," I replied honestly. "They didn't understand it and didn't think it was important. But that turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I learned to believe in myself without needing their approval." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "My parents want me to be a doctor or lawyer. They think technology isn't stable enough for girls." "Show them what stability looks like when you build your own success," I suggested. Sometimes families need to see results before they can understand possibilities. 5 years after the wedding revelation, David and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Elizabeth after my grandmother, who had first taught me about financial independence. Holding my baby girl in the hospital, I thought about the kind of parent I wanted to be: supportive but not enabling, encouraging but not overwhelming, proud but not possessive. During one of Elizabeth's first visits with her grandparents, I watched Mom and Dad interact with their granddaughter with the pure joy and attention I had craved as a child. But instead of feeling resentful, I felt grateful that they had learned to see clearly, even if it had taken 30 years. "She's going to be brilliant like her mother," Dad said, cradling Elizabeth gently. "She's going to be whoever she wants to be," I replied. "And we're going to support whatever that turns out to be." Jake, now a successful MBA graduate working in corporate strategy, was a devoted uncle who seemed determined to apply the lessons he'd learned from our family dynamics. "I'm going to pay attention to her from day one," he promised. no assumptions about what she's capable of or what she needs. The commitment felt genuine and gave me hope that the next generation of our family would grow up with more balanced attention and support. Looking back on the journey from invisible daughter to acknowledged success story, I realized that both phases had been necessary for my development. The years of being overlooked taught me self-reliance, internal motivation, and the ability to build something meaningful without external validation. The revelation and its aftermath taught me the importance of authenticity, the value of setting boundaries, and the possibility of transforming family relationships through honest communication. The $30 million in my investment accounts was significant, but it wasn't the most valuable thing I had gained. The real treasure was the knowledge that I could create something extraordinary on my own terms, maintain my integrity under pressure, and rebuild relationships that had seemed irreparably damaged. My story wasn't ultimately about money or family favoritism. It was about the courage to be authentic in a world that often rewards conformity, the persistence to pursue excellence without recognition, and the wisdom to know that external validation is nice, but internal satisfaction is essential. Today, when people ask about the secret to my success, I tell them it wasn't the technology expertise or the market timing or the venture capital funding. It was learning to value myself accurately, regardless of how others perceived me, and building something meaningful, whether anyone was watching or not. The little girl who grew up in Jake's shadow became a woman who created her own light. And that transformation, from invisible to authentic, was worth every difficult moment of the journey. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay small to make others comfortable. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your family is showing them who you really are, even if it challenges everything they thought they knew about you. And sometimes the person who believes in you least needs to be proven wrong, not through argument or confrontation, but through the quiet, persistent accumulation of extraordinary achievement. That's the lesson I hope to pass on to my daughter Elizabeth. Build something beautiful. Stay true to yourself, and never let anyone else's limited vision determine what you're capable of becoming. The girl who was overlooked became the woman who couldn't be ignored. And in the end, that made all the difference.